Hello, my name is Michael Hart. I'm the host of The Michael Hart Show, as well as the author of Unknown America Myths and Little Known Oddities about the greatest nation on earth. For the last 15 years or so, I've been a conservative talk radio host that transitioned in the last year basically to online. And my program can be heard Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 Central on the Hart, H-A-R-T, Heart of America Broadcasting Network. But other things that I wanted to do because of the things that we cover on the program is do this YouTube channel. And although there's quite a few audios that are actually up on the Heart of America YouTube channel, this is our very first video, and we're really excited to be able to share this time with you today. Each week, or maybe even twice, we're going to bring to you about 15 or 20 minutes of Unknown America, myths and little known oddities about the greatest nation on earth, and share with you some of the things that are going on in this country that you might not be aware of, because you have to understand the history of this country, what's not being taught in our schools, if you truly want to understand what's going on in the news cycle today. Obviously, there's a lot of dust-ups between President Trump and the four horsewomen of the apocalypse and all the discussions about socialism and progressivism and racism in this country. And one of the biggest, just complete miscalculations, what exactly the progressive movement is all about. And I firmly believe, again, that if you don't understand the history of this country, you cannot grasp what's going on in the news around you. So we need to go all the way back into the very first days of American history to see what's going on in the White House and in America in 2019. I should be able to wrap this up today in about 15 or 20 minutes, but people that have been listening to me any length of time know, well, I can get a little bit long-winded from time to time, but if you'll bear with me, just a little bit of backstory. We have to go all the way back to the central banking system. And no, this isn't a video or a lesson on the Federal Reserve banking system. America's had two central banks in its history, both of them created in part to pay off the debts the country actually incurred over the wartime efforts of the Revolutionary War, and then, of course, the War of 1812. The charter after the second bank, the central bank, actually ended in 1836. From the period of 1836 on up to 1913, when we got the Federal Reserve Banking Act, there was no central bank in this country. And there's been a lot of debate over the years as to whether or not there even should have ever been. So with that as kind of the aside to all this, and understand that America had a lot of debts to pay, there was a lot of debate in political circles as to how to best satisfy and ease that debt moving forward. So now if we have to jump all the way from 1836 all the way up to 1901. At this period in time, Teddy Roosevelt gets elected president of the United States as a Republican. Roosevelt is very, very, very popular, and he serves two terms. In 1909, rather, Roosevelt's going to term out. Technically, I guess he could have run again, and he actually tried to, because there was nothing in the Constitution that prevented him at this point in American history from running for a third term, or in the case of FDR, even a fourth. At this point in time, and up to this point in time, there was a lot of discussion about the implementation of a central bank for the United States. Today, we call it the Federal Reserve. And this is where the progressive ideologies that we're dealing with today stem from. It's interesting to note so many of the things that we hear from the Democrat Party about Trump, taxes, what's going on in terms of the economy, job growth, stagnant job growth, job creation, whatever. All the things that the Democrats point towards that they are concerned with, whether that to be the Green New Deal and Trump's aversion to it, all this stems from the fact that for the last 100 plus years, the progressive movement in this country has been trying to overtake the United States economy. Going back to Roosevelt for just a moment, Roosevelt was somewhat supportive of the idea of a Federal Reserve Bank. But again, in the year 1909, he was going to leave office, and Howard Taft was actually elected. Taft was not necessarily opposed to a federal bank, but he did not like the way the policies were being written and the bills and the people that were behind it. So he became very much in opposition to what was going on. The powers that be in America were very concerned about the reelection of Howard Taft, who was remarkably popular at this period in time. So what they wanted to do was find somebody that was completely on board with the Federal Reserve banking system, that was very pliable, or for their purposes, malleable. And they found that person in Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the former dean, the head of Princeton University, and former governor of New Jersey. And he was a complete lapdog. But the people, the powers that be behind the scenes, were very concerned as to whether or not Wilson could get elected. So, to help skim some of the votes away from Taft and assure that Woodrow Wilson in 1912 would receive the presidency, gain the presidency, they ran Teddy Roosevelt as an offshoot Republican under the Bull Moose Party. Now, the Bull Moose Party was established in 1912. And when you're looking at the things that are going on in this country today, it's very important to remember that particular date. But what was the real inspiration, the desire? Well, first off, it was the European bankers and their desire to bring America back in under British banking regulations. But this was really inspired during the Roosevelt administration, when we have what's called the banking crisis of 1907, which caused a run on the banks. This gave a lot of fuel to the people that really wanted to implement a central banking system, supposedly under the auspices of shoring up the United States economy. Taft was having nothing to do with it. Wilson was a willing pawn. Teddy Roosevelt thought he might regain the White House, and again ran as a progressive Republican under the banner of Bull Moose. Now, Wilson's actually successful. Taft is out of the picture. Teddy Roosevelt has served his purpose. Wilson was so bad, he was such a pawn, that his entire cabinet was actually picked for him by a guy that history has pretty much ignored, somebody that we speak about, quite frankly, on the Heart of America broadcast. His name is Colonel Mandell, Edward Mandell House. He was the primary advisor to Woodrow Wilson in the 2012 election and was instrumental in taking us where we were then to where we are today. Interestingly enough, many of the players within the organizations, the secret societies, if you will, that really run America, are the descendants of the people from around that time in American history. Mandell House was a very important person to the movement of creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, this is a copy of my book, Unknown America. And if you look over here, you'll see a picture of the inauguration parade. And I didn't intend to use this today as an example because it's not the greatest picture because it's cut off here at the spine. But this person right here is actually Colonel House sitting next to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson during his inauguration parade. Yeah, they were that close. But here's where it gets interesting. During the year 1912, leading up to the election of Woodrow Wilson, Colonel House writes a book called Philip Drew, Administrator. This is a copy of the book. Now, obviously, this is a recent edition of the book. You can still get these things on Amazon or 100 different places online. But this particular book tells the story of a guy by the name of Philip Drew, and his last name is spelled D-R-U. But I want to read the backside of the book, which explains a little bit about what Mandell House, Colonel House, had to say about what was going on in this period in American history. Reading straight from the book. Philip Drew, Administrator, A Story of Tomorrow, 1920 to 1935, is a futuristic political novel published anonymously in 1912 by Edward Mandell House, an American diplomat, politician, and political presidential foreign policy advisor. His book's hero leads the democratic Western U.S. into a civil war against the plutocratic East and becomes the dictator of America. Drew, as dictator, imposes a series of reforms that resemble the Bull Moose platform of 1912. You see, the things that they wanted to do at that period of time was to get the Federal Reserve banking system in place so that a select few people, if you want to call it an oligarchy, be my guest, but a select few people could actually control the economy of the United States. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, but Woodrow Wilson was also told what to do, what to think, and when he would do it. Now, what's interesting about this is from the book itself, the Democratic Western U.S. When the Bull Moose Party was dissolved some years later, it then became the California Progressive Party. Now, interestingly enough, the California Progressive Party, the Democratic West, you know how we're always hearing about the elimination of the Electoral College? And so many people in this country believe that we're a democracy when we're actually a representative republic. That was the Western culture that he was speaking about when the Democratic Western U.S. battles. Now, this is the fantasy world of House, futuristic. Remember, the Western U.S. battles the plutocratic East. In case you didn't know, a plutocrat is somebody who is a business tycoon, somebody who is very accomplished in business, somebody that believes, at least in the case of the views of House, that the government should be run by banks or corporate interest. In the book, Philip Drew Administrator, we have House actually telegraphing 100 years ago what the struggle would be for the future of America. And we're seeing that very thing happen today as so many of the reform policies of the Roosevelt administration are the very policies that are being championed by the left-leaning Democrats, and to a somewhat lesser degree, the freshmen four, the squad, if you want to call them that, who quite frankly, and I'm not going to get deep into this today, we'll do this in a future edition of this program, are nothing more than political pawns with other people pulling their strings for the purposes of moving the party further to the left. This has been the desire of the left progressives since the inception of the idea to get a Federal Reserve banking system in place so they could control the economy. For those of you that pay attention to the news as much as I do, Chief of Staff for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, this fellow named Chakrabarty, has said in recent statements that the Green New Deal is in fact an attempt to control the economy. We also know that some of the freshmen four have ties to George Soros and his organizations and his political groups. Now, for those of you that might not know, Soros actually made the brunt of his money by shorting the pound sterling in England. Yes, he's made his fortune by destroying economies. And you might think, well, this guy's a multi-billionaire. Why would he even care? The reality of it is it has nothing to do with money, at least not from his perspective. It has to do with the gamemanship. It's a big international game that involves American politicians, international diplomats, and European bankers. It always has been that way because America is the Bank of the United States. So here we have in 1912 the justification of the movement penned in the pages of supposedly a fictitious book authored by Mandell. I'd also like to point out a couple of other things here. In addition to that, House was instrumental in pushing Wilson towards entry into World War I. Now, when does a central bank make the most amount of money? Central bank's purpose as a semi-private institution, there is some government oversight, but a central bank makes its most money by loaning money to its host country. When does a country need the most money? During times of war. So now you have Woodrow Wilson in 1912. That is the inspiration for the Federal Reserve Banking Act of 1913, which allows these European bankers to capitalize on the progressive ideologies of House and so many of the European bankers of their time, in addition to Wilson. I don't want to go too deep into the weeds today, talking about what has taken place over the course of the last several years as it relates to the progressive movement. But it's important to see because people talk frequently about George Soros. They talk about Saul Alinsky and a whole host of other cast of characters. But we tend to forget the time period when Colonel Edward Mandell House served as the primary administrator and advisor to Woodrow Wilson during the entry into World War I and what would become today's modern progressive movement. But it becomes much more complex from there. So let me grab something real quick, because I want to share something with you that I will admit is a bit on the conspiratorial side, but I'm going to offer this for your consideration. There was a book written in 1898. The name of that book at the time was called Futility. Now the book has been given its modern title. When I say modern, I mean in the last 50, 60, 70 years. The name of the book is The Wreck of the Titan by Morgan Robertson. Now, in the most literal ISBN number site, and an ISBN number is what you assign to a book for identification purposes, the name of the book is Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. What does this have to do with American history? Well, let me give you a little bit of interesting tidbits about the fictitious Titan that Morgan Robertson writes about in 1898. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read from my own book because, well, this program is brought to you by the Unknown America Project. The issue with the actual Titanic and the Titan. Check these things out. You got to bear in mind, the Titanic went down in 1912. Same year Woodrow Wilson's elected president. Taft is out. But consider these comparisons. Both the fictitious Titan and the Titanic were described by the media as the largest craft afloat and the greatest works of men. The Titan was 800 feet long, displacing 45,000 tons. The Titanic was 880 feet long, displacing 4,600 tons. Both ships in the press were described as unsinkable. Both had a triple screw propeller, which was fairly rare at this point in time. Both ships were short on lifeboats, both the fictitious Titan and the very real Titanic. The Titan carried 24, which was as few as the law allowed. This number would carry less than half of her total capacity. By comparison, the Titanic carried 16 lifeboats plus 4 folding lifeboats, the fewest the law would allow. Both ships sank after hitting icebergs, the fictitious Titan and the very real Titanic. The Titan was traveling at 25 knots when it struck an iceberg on its starboard side at night in the North Atlantic, 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland. By comparison, the Titanic was moving at 23 knots, struck an iceberg on its starboard side at night in the North Atlantic, exactly 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland. Now, this book was written 14 years before the real Titanic sunk. Now, what does this have to do with the progressive movement, the Federal Reserve Bank, or anything going on in modern day American politics? Possibly nothing. But consider, despite the fact that the Titanic was owned by the White Star Line, the investment team behind the ownership of this boat was J.P. Morgan, one of the wealthiest men in America at this time. Morgan owned the Titanic. Morgan also was a big proponent and advocate for the Federal Reserve banking system, referencing the bank panic of 1907 for the justification of a Federal Reserve Bank. Morgan was not to sit on the board of the Federal Reserve. However, his peers were. We don't have time to get into the Federal Reserve stuff today, and quite frankly, there's enough of it out in the internet and the creature from Jekyll Island. I just want you to understand what happened in 1912 that's impacting America today. J.P. Morgan owns the Titanic. Not my opinion. Google it if you're so compelled. He controls much of the banking apparatus in this country, puts the investors together that would be the primary investors in this shipping line. In addition to that, J.P. Morgan because this was her maiden voyage, had booked passage on the Titanic. However, he canceled that trip for no given reason just days before she sunk. He wasn't the only one. There has been long speculation that there was passengers on this vessel that were in opposition to the creation of a Federal Reserve banking system, which would give us the leverage for today's modern progressive movement. Is this evidence circumstantial? It absolutely is. Some years ago, obviously, Morgan Robertson was interviewed about whether or not this was some kind, and I'll admit it's a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy theory. Whether or not he was projecting a plan by some kind of forces to bring the Titanic down and perhaps get to some people that would have been in opposition to the progressive movement in that era. Now, Robertson denied it. He was a known, well-experienced seafaring sailor, and he said it's purely coincidental. But the same month, the same week in April of 1912, iceberg's starboard side, exactly 400 nautical miles from Newfoundland. Is it possible? Because J.P. Morgan would have had the impact and the influence over the ship's line to help craft the journey. Is it possible, based on the book, The Wreck of the Titan, that the powers that be would have known there was at least a likelihood that the Titanic would get in trouble and possibly even suffer the same fate? In the book, The Wreck of the Titan, even the graphics look identical to the Titanic. Again, this is all conspiratorial and it's all circumstantial. But it is interesting to note one other little funny, that from a grammatical perspective, the suffix ic, means resembling or pertaining to. So you have the Titan over here, but then we have the Titanic over there. Is it possible the ship was named the Titanic purposefully? Titanic, referring to the Titan? It's just something to ponder. If this ship had gone down 2 years earlier or 2 years later, this particular conspiracy theory dies long ago. But it's also interesting to note that one of the passengers on the Titanic that did in fact survive was one of the closest advisors to President Howard Taft, who was opposed to a central banking system that would allow the progressive movement to take control of the economy. Just things that are worth pondering, things for your consideration. This is why I believe in my heart that the history of this country matters. The past matters, and you don't always have to go back 100 years. But I want you to understand, in closing today and in future editions of this program, we will get deeper into the Titanic. We're going to get deeper into Cloward Piven and that strategy, which is actually what's happening on our southern border. But whether it has to do with immigration or building the wall, the humanitarian crisis to the south, Obamacare, the Green New Deal, all of this is being done purposely to collapse the capitalist system that we have in this country for the implementation of socialism. You think I'm kidding? You think I'm misleading you? Buy the book. This book was written in 1912 by one of the biggest progressive socialists this country has ever produced. One that was impactful in getting us into the First World War, the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank, the League of Nations, which also occurred under Wilson, now known as the United Nations, who was very much in bed with the European bankers that ever since the War of 1812 have desired to bring the United States back in under British banking law. And that's what we're seeing today. So when you're listening to Democrats or liberals scream about being on the side of the little man, desiring to help the blue-collar workers, implementations of certain social programs, no, ladies and gentlemen, this is a wholesale kidnapping. It's a kidnapping of the United States economic system for their own gain so they can implement their socialist ideologies and their socialist programs. And in closing, I want to read this to you one more time, just so you understand that what is going on in this country today was going on over 100 years ago. The arguments are almost identical. Again, Philip Drew Administrator, A Story of Tomorrow, is a futuristic political novel published anonymously in 1912, the year Woodrow Wilson's elected, by Edward Mandell House, an American diplomat, politician, presidential foreign policy advisor. His book's hero, Drew, leads the Democratic Western U.S., which would eventually become the California Progressive Party, in a civil war. Civil. Say civil. It says it right here. In a civil war against the plutocratic East. And somebody, again, that's plutocratic is a business titan that governs from an economic policy position and not a government one. The plutocratic East and becomes the dictator, the progressive dictator of America. Drew, as dictator, imposes a series of reform that resemble the Bull Moose Party of Theodore Roosevelt that was completely socialized in this country. That's the blueprint for what's going on today, and that's what you need to keep an eye on as we continue to see pawn after puppet paraded across our news screens, our devices, and our feeds as people that are so inept, they do not even realize that they are advancing an agenda that was put into place hundreds of years ago, decades and decades and decades before their parents were even born. So as you're watching the news of the day, understand that before we ever saw a George Soros or a Saul Alinsky, back in the day, we had Colonel Edward Mandell House. He's the author of what's really going on in this country today. This is what President Trump's fighting against. And this is why we have to stand up against the progressive movements in this country, because they have been at it. They tried it under Wilson. They tried it under FDR. But they have finally learned a very critical lesson in this day and time. And that is, you cannot implement socialism piecemeal. You must bring capitalism to its knees and have a wholesale destruction so that you can have a wholesale introduction of the socialist policies they espoused over 100 years ago. That's where Cloward Piven comes into play. And the next time we get together, which should be in the next few days, and we'll announce it online, we'll discuss the Cloward Piven strategy and its plans to destroy capitalism so the progressive platform can be fully installed. Again, this is Heart of America. My name is Michael Hart. You can check us out online at Hart, H-A-R-T, heartofamerica.net. Each and every Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. Central Time. Pick up a copy of Unknown America, Myths and Little Known Oddities about the greatest nation on earth by going over to theunknownamerica.com. That's theunknownamerica.com. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for listening. And do us a favor. Tell people what you learn in this video, because it's very, very, very important to people that realize that, well, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world, they don't know what they're doing. And I don't mean they don't know what they're talking about. They legitimately do not know what they're doing, because just like in 1912, they are malleable pawns and puppets of a nefarious bunch of people whose only desire is to destroy this nation and her future for their own personal gains. Thanks for tuning in.